Welcome to the Huberman Lab podcast, where we discuss science and science-based tools for everyday life. I'm Andrew Huberman, and I'm a professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford School of Medicine. Today we are discussing the lymphatic system. For many of you, the lymphatic system probably sounds a little bit esoteric. And for many of you, the lymphatic system may even draw up notions of people talking about lymphatic clearance or doing bizarre seeming types of very light massage or jade rollers or bouncing on trampolines. And I must say, in researching this episode, I came to three general conclusions that I think are important to point out right now. First of all, your lymphatic system is absolutely essential to your immediate and long-term health. It's an incredible system that is serving you right now as you listen to this, and it's a system that you need to support. The second conclusion is that the lymphatic system is somewhat cryptic, and it doesn't get as much attention as, say, the cardiovascular system or your brain and nervous system, or even the gut microbiome. And then the third conclusion is that the lymphatic system, and what is sometimes just generally referred to as lymphatics, often get kind of a bad rap. And the reason is that a lot of the practices that are out there in the wellness space and health space that relate to lymphatics can often seem a little bit goofy or odd or kind of new agey or woo. Things like rebounding, like bouncing on a trampoline, or shaking, things of that sort. And to some extent, they look odd because typically those aren't behaviors that most people engage in every day. But once you understand the structure and function of the lymphatic system, which you soon will, you'll realize why things like rebounding, things like treading water, things like specific ways of breathing actually serve the lymphatic system quite well. And there's a real basis for why those practices actually work. So those are three general points about the lymphatic system to keep in mind today as we move forward. Another thing to keep in mind is that the lymphatic system is directly related to your appearance. Later, you'll learn why if you were to stay up for one night and not get any sleep, or even just get a poor night's sleep, and you look at your face in the morning, you look very different after a poor night's sleep than you do after a great night's sleep. Sometimes you even look very different immediately upon waking after a great night's sleep, as opposed to a couple of hours later. Many people wake up with kind of bags under their eyes, they look kind of groggy, they look much older, and then a couple of hours later, they look fresh, and that stuff is all cleared away. And certainly not by doing anything cosmetic in terms of makeup or anything. That transition from bags under the eyes, feeling, a heaviness in the face, the eyes tired, a sort of lack of life in the face and eyes, and then later, just a couple of hours, looking vibrant, the face looking very fresh and ready for the day, that has everything to do with what's called lymphatic clearance and the lymphatic system of the face and neck. So today you're going to learn how the lymphatic system works. You're going to learn how to support your lymphatic system for your immediate and long-term health, as well as for appearance. And you're going to learn about if you were to have, say, an injury to the body, or God forbid, if you were suffering from cancer, how you could support your lymphatic system. And in talking about all of this, you'll be able to make sense of why it is that things like lymphatic massage or the various tools and treatments that are out there may actually work, and why some of them perhaps should be avoided. And as a final point, you're also going to realize by the end of today's episode that the lymphatic system is one of the major reasons why exercise supports longevity and heart health and brain health and all the other things that we've heard that exercise can provide. The point here is that your lymphatic system sits central to everything we care about in terms of immediate and long-term health. And as you'll soon see, it's also just a really cool system. Before we begin, I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my teaching and research roles at Stanford. It is, however, part of my desire and effort to bring zero cost to consumer information about science and science-related tools to the general public. In keeping with that theme, today's episode does include sponsors. Okay, let's get into the lymphatic system. But in order to get into the lymphatic system, we need to talk briefly about the circulatory system for blood. Now, everybody knows what the heart is. The heart is this organ that pumps blood. Many of you are probably familiar with the fact that the heart has different chambers, different compartments. But the heart also has two major jobs that are quite different from one another, and two major anatomical distinctions that allow those functions to occur. And those functions, broadly speaking, are to deliver oxygenated blood to all the tissues of your body, including your brain, your spleen. Every organ and tissue in the body needs oxygenated blood. And also to return the non-oxygenated blood back to the heart and back to the lungs so that it can get reoxygenated. So I'm just going to briefly describe the blood circulatory system in very broad terms. We probably should do an entire episode about heart health and heart function, and we will. But for those of you not familiar with how the heart works, basically the heart is going to pump blood out through what are called arteries. You've all heard of arteries, which are fairly large diameter tubes. They have walls of those tubes that can resist a lot of pressure. And that's important because we need to put a lot of pressure to be able to pump blood far out into the body, out to your fingertips, your toes, and everything in between. Okay. Oxygenated blood is going to travel out through those arteries. And then eventually, as those arteries approach the tissues that they need to oxygenate, and by the way, the blood is delivering not just oxygen, but also glucose, blood sugar, hormones, different proteins, amino acids, all the stuff that your tissues need, not just oxygen. But then those arteries are going to transition into smaller diameter tubes that we call the arterioles. And then eventually, as those arterioles approach the tissues they need to deliver all that stuff, all those goodies within the blood, those arterioles are going to transition and start branching into what are called capillaries. Most of you have probably heard of capillaries. Capillaries have a very, very thin wall, just one cell thick, which allows things within the blood, like oxygen, amino acids, and other things that the cells in the tissues of your body need, to actually get out into those tissues. Okay, so most of us think about the blood system as pumping stuff out there, but we probably haven't thought about how the stuff that needs to get to our cells actually gets out of the blood and into those cells. And I just explained how. By having a very thin-walled set of capillaries carrying that oxygenated, amino acid containing, glucose containing blood, those nutrients and that oxygen can actually get out of the vasculature, out of those capillaries, and into the cells that need them. Okay? At a future date, I'll talk about the actual mechanics of how that's done, but for right now, I think that's sufficient. Now, once that stuff arrives in the tissue, and here when I say tissue, it could be brain tissue, it could be muscle tissue, it could be liver tissue. Once that stuff gets out into the cells are going to use it. They're going to use the oxygen, they're going to use the glucose, they're going to use the amino acids, they're going to use the hormones. And as a consequence, they are going to create some waste products. There's going to be carbon dioxide that's created. There's going to be cellular waste in the form of actual physical debris. There's going to be metabolites. There's going to be ammonia. Basically, a bunch of waste product is going to then get kicked out of those cells into what's called the extracellular space. Now, a couple times today, I'll talk about what's referred to as the interstitial space. The interstitial space is the area around the cells of the various tissues and organs of your body. And fluid and these waste products gets kicked out into that interstitial space between the cells. So once it's there, it needs to be cleared out of there. How is it cleared out of there? Some of it will be taken back up into the blood supply, and with it, a lot of water, a lot of fluid. I didn't mention this yet, but a lot of fluid, a lot of water gets out of the vasculature and into those cells and into the interstitial space around those cells while it's delivering all those nutrients and goodies that we talked about a minute ago. Now, some of the waste product and the water, so carbon dioxide and water, et cetera, will be taken back up by the blood supply. How does that happen? Well, there are capillaries that are referred to as venous capillaries. Okay, so we talked about the arterial system, which delivers oxygenated blood. There's also another system called the venous system, which takes deoxygenated blood back up to be oxygenated by the lungs. And it does that, of course, in concert with the heart. So we have the arterial system that delivers oxygenated blood. There are rare exceptions of arteries that deliver non-oxygenated blood to tissues such as the lungs, but let's just set that aside for now. We've got these arterial system that delivers oxygenated blood. And then now we have the venous system. So we have these little venous capillaries that are also just one cell wall thick. And the water, the carbon dioxide, the ammonia, the waste products is going to get reabsorbed there. It's going to then go from small diameter tubes, the venous capillaries, up to larger diameter tubes, and eventually into the veins that are going to deliver that blood and the waste products and the carbon dioxide back to the heart and lungs to be reoxygenated and then sent back out to the body. Okay? And you may have heard the word pulmonary before. If you haven't, that's okay. The pulmonary system is the aspect of the circulatory system that is directed towards the lungs to oxygenate the blood. Okay, so we've got this really nice looped system where oxygenated blood can get out to the tissues of the body. The cells in those tissues can use the oxygen, the nutrients, et cetera, and the water and the carbon dioxide and ammonia and other waste products that come from just cells doing their business, from them doing all the things that they need to do as a liver cell, as a brain cell, et cetera, is then going to be passed back into the circulatory system and then back to the heart and lungs so that the waste products can be expelled. For instance, when you exhale, the carbon dioxide is expelled from your body. And when you inhale, you bring in more oxygen that then gets on hemoglobin and then back through the arterial system and so on and so forth. Okay, so it's a beautiful system. And even if you only captured 5 to 10% of what I just said, you certainly will have in mind now that your circulatory system for your blood is sending out oxygenated stuff, returning non-oxygenated stuff that also has a lot of waste product in it, and that there's a lot of water in that whole business. This is all liquid and proteins and glucose, et cetera, but there's a lot of water in this whole thing. After all, your blood is liquid. So the important thing to understand about the lymphatic system is that the lymphatic system is there waiting at the interstitial space and at the interface between this arterial system that delivers oxygenated blood and the venous system of capillaries that collects the deoxygenated blood and all these waste products. And it's right there as a series of tubes ready to catch the excess fluid and the waste products and bring them back to the heart also, but to do a lot of really important things with them along the way. You might say, why would you have this third system, right? The circulatory system for blood sounds nearly perfect. And the key is it's not perfect. Your lymphatic system is responsible for taking the fluid that remains in the extracellular space and all the gunk, all the waste products from cellular metabolism, again, proteins, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and bringing that back into the circulatory system of blood, but along the way doing a number of very important things, including checking it out to see whether or not there are any contaminants, right? Any infections, bacterial or viral infections. That occurs in structures called the lymph nodes, which you've probably heard of and we will return to a little bit later. But leaving aside the immune surveillance role of the lymphatic system, just the mere role of needing to clear away what really is about 3 to 4 liters of excess fluid in the interstitial space is so important. You might say, well, how important can it really be, right? 3 or 4 liters, is it really that important? It is absolutely crucial. Why? Because if too much fluid and amino acids and cellular waste products build up in the tissues that are using the oxygenated blood and need all the nutrients, that is ripe for infection, right? Bacteria love to grow in warm environments with lots of amino acids. It's ripe for inflammation because of the CO2 and because of the ammonia and the waste products. And if that inflammation occurs, you get buildup of tissue, in particular adipose tissue can really thicken, skin can thicken, and it starts becoming chronically inflamed. And this is something that, believe it or not, is fairly common. It's common in people who are obese. It's common in people that don't move enough. We'll talk about why that's so in a moment. The lymphatic system's just basic role for draining that fluid out of the interstitial space is something that all of us should really care about, healthy or unhealthy. So even if you're not obese, you need to get your lymphatic system tuned up so that it's clearing that stuff. It's clearing what we call lymph, which is kind of like a sticky fluid because it's got stuff other than water in there. It's got all those waste products, and it rarely has red blood cells in it, but it often can have a few white blood cells, and it can have some other stuff in it. And we need to clear that out. So it's semi-viscous. It's not super fluid. It's not a gel. It's kind of somewhere in between. And we need to clear that out. In fact, if we don't clear it out, our body very quickly goes into local or systemic inflammation. And if we don't clear it out within the brain, we get what's called brain fog. You get cognitive impairment. And the brain fog that occurs from lack of lymphatic clearance from brain tissue comes on very quickly, even after one poor night's sleep. And it is very severe. If any of you have ever experienced brain fog, it is awful. The inability to kind of hold a thought and maintain a thought, and you're kind of somewhere between sleep and awake, and then you're kind of stressed about that is serious. So the mere clearance of the stuff from the extracellular space, the water, CO2, and waste products by the lymphatic system is crucial. So before I talk about the immune surveillance role of the lymphatic system, I want to talk about what you can do to encourage the collection and drainage of all that extracellular fluid and the waste products with it. I'd like to take a quick break and acknowledge one of our sponsors, Element. Element is an electrolyte drink that has everything you need and nothing you don't. That means the electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, all in the correct ratios, but no sugar. Proper hydration is critical for brain and body function. Even a slight degree of dehydration can diminish your cognitive and physical performance. It's also important that you get adequate electrolytes. The electrolytes, sodium, magnesium, and potassium, are vital for the functioning of all cells in your body, especially your neurons or your nerve cells. Drinking Element makes it very easy to ensure that you're getting adequate hydration and adequate electrolytes. My days tend to start really fast, meaning I have to jump right into work or right into exercise. So to make sure that I'm hydrated and I have sufficient electrolytes, when I first wake up in the morning, I drink 16 to 32 ounces of water with an Element packet dissolved in it. I also drink Element dissolved in water during any kind of physical exercise that I'm doing, especially on hot days when I'm sweating a lot and losing water and electrolytes. Element has a bunch of great tasting flavors. In fact, I love them all. I love the watermelon, the raspberry, the citrus, and I really love the lemonade flavor. So if you'd like to try Element, you can go to drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free Element sample pack with any purchase. Again, that's drinkelement.com/Huberman to claim a free sample pack. Today's episode is also brought to us by David. David makes a protein bar unlike any other. It has 28 grams of protein, only 150 calories, and 0 grams of sugar. That's right, 28 grams of protein, and 75% of its calories come from protein. That's 50% higher than the next closest protein bar. These bars from David also taste amazing. Right now, my favorite flavor is the new cinnamon roll flavor, but I also like the chocolate chip cookie dough flavor, and I also like the salted peanut butter flavor. Basically, I like all the flavors. They're all delicious. Also, big news, David bars are now back in stock. They were sold out for several months because they are that popular, but they are now back in stock. By eating a David bar, I'm able to get 28 grams of protein in the calories of a snack, which makes it very easy for me to meet my protein goals of 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day, and to do so without eating excess calories. I generally eat a David bar most afternoons, and I always keep them with me when I'm away from home or traveling because they're incredibly convenient to get enough protein. As I mentioned, they're incredibly delicious, and given that 28 grams of protein, they're pretty filling for just 150 calories, so they're great between meals as well. If you'd like to try David, you can go to davidprotein.com/Huberman. Again, that's davidprotein.com/Huberman. Okay, so let's talk about the lymphatic system, focusing on the lymphatic vessels, which are basically just tubes. Okay, tubes of different sizes depending on where you are in the body and what you need to accomplish. But here's a really key point that everyone should know. We spend so much time and attention thinking about the lymph nodes, which of course are super important, right? You go to the doctor, you say you're not feeling well, they're going to feel your lymph nodes. I'll explain why they do that in a minute. They're going to feel under your jaw. Maybe you've had swollen lymph nodes where your legs meet your groin. You have them in your armpits. You'll occasionally feel some swelling or some kind of dull pain. By the way, that dull pain or swelling isn't necessarily a sign of a systemic infection. It could be, but it's not necessarily a sign of an infection. We'll talk about what the lymph nodes do, but the lymphatic vessels don't get nearly enough attention, in my opinion. Your entire body is innervated, as we say, by these lymphatic vessels, right? From your little pinky toe and all your toes and your feet, any tissue in your body, because it needs blood and oxygen and nutrients, and because the cells there create waste products, and because some of that fluid remains in the interstitial space, doesn't make it back into the vasculature, you need lymphatic vessels everywhere. You need them in your brain, you need them in your skin, you need them in your adipose tissue, your fat, that is. You need them everywhere. And so if I were to give you a map of the lymphatic vessels across the body, it would just look like spaghetti everywhere. Lymph nodes are going to be those larger compartments where some of the lymphatic fluid and the stuff within it is sequestered for a bit, monitored for infections, and then passed along. We'll get back to that later. The lymphatic vessels have a very important property, which is that they are one-way vessels, okay? Fluid can only pass one direction through them. And that unidirectionality of the vessels is oh so important when thinking about how to encourage lymphatic drainage and lymphatic flow. And when I say lymphatic flow, what I really mean is the passage of fluid from the interstitial extracellular space into these lymphatic vessels. Sometimes people will call them lymphatic ducts, but that's actually a technical term related to something else. But into these lymphatic vessels, then through these vessels and back into the venous blood supply where all sorts of good things happen, and we'll talk about it in a bit. So they're one-way vessels. And if you think about the lymph, that accumulates and then goes into the vessels in, say, your feet. If it's a one-way vessel, you need that vessel is going to be directed towards the heart, right? The fluid will be able to go towards the heart, right? Because eventually that's where this stuff needs to go. It needs to dump back into the venous blood supply, get oxygenated and so forth. And the waste has to be disposed. And we have this thing called gravity, which is pulling down, right? It's pulling down. It's a force that's literally pulling down, and you got these one-way vessels trying to pass lymph, which is fluid, but it's kind of a slightly viscous fluid up toward the heart. You also have lymphatic vessels in your hands, in your arms, and gravity is, of course, pulling down on the fluid within them as well, and your brain, etc. Now, here's a critical feature of the lymphatic system that is different from the cardiovascular system, which is there's no pump. In the cardiovascular system, you have a pump, you have a heart that can generate a lot of force to move that liquid out through the arteries and back through the veins, and you've got a lot of mechanical force coming from that heart. The lymphatic system doesn't have that at all. On its own, it's a passive system, no pump, and it's fighting gravity all the time. So how does lymph move through these lymphatic vessels? Nature came up with a brilliant solution. It's actually the movement of your body that creates the movement of lymph up through these vessels from the lower half of your body, or down from the vessels in the upper part of your body, or in from your arms and fingers toward the center of your body to eventually be returned back to the venous blood supply. This is really important to understand. The movement of your muscles, not necessarily resistance training, although that would contribute to it, but low-level muscular contractions of the sort that occur when you walk, when you stand up and sit down again, when you make little micro movements. But certainly the movement of the large musculature of your body in particular, like your legs and your trunk and your arms, that's what's going to move this lymphatic fluid along, because the lymphatic vessels can sit very superficially, just underneath the skin, right? Very, very close to the surface. The lymphatic system also has these, small diameter things we call lymphatic capillaries, but it has bigger diameter vessels within the deeper tissues, closer to the muscle and intimately related to what's called the fascia. I know some of you have heard of the fascia, some of you perhaps have not. If you've ever prepared a steak and you saw there's kind of a not the fatty stuff, but it's like a white fibrous sheet that you can almost peel off the meat. Your muscles are surrounded by fascia, and those deep lymphatic vessels are closely tied to the fascia and to the muscular system, so that when you move your body, walking or running, could be exercise, but even just everyday activities, that lymphatic fluid is being carried back up toward the heart to return and join the blood supply. So hopefully you're getting a sense of the organizational logic of the lymphatic system. Nature has co-opted movement as a way to move lymphatic fluid along and encourage lymphatic drainage. And you want lymphatic drainage. You want that fluid pulled out of the extracellular space into those vessels and then returned back to the heart. And as I mentioned before, a bunch of other great things happen along the way in terms of immune surveillance. So if we're going to discuss protocols, one of the most important ways to encourage lymphatic drainage, which is a good thing, and to encourage the general health of your lymphatic system, because you don't want lymph sitting stagnant in those vessels, especially if it has contaminants within it, is to make sure that you're moving enough each day. And we hear a lot these days about, you need 10,000 steps a day, or maybe it's just 7,000, or maybe it's 3,000. No one can really come up with a single answer, because it depends on which system you're trying to create support for, the cardiovascular system, the brain system. But I think a good number, a good thing to shoot for, is at least 7,000 steps per day. I happen to have some steps in my home, not a lot of them, but I find that if I'm going up and down those stairs a lot per day, that's good, and probably is a little different than if I was just walking on a flat surface. Sometimes I'll get out and get 12,000 steps in a day, or if I'm visiting a new city and I'm walking a lot, 20,000 steps. But I really strive to get enough steps per day. And you will notice that if you don't get enough steps per day, your system, your body will feel kind of sluggish. If you're sitting a lot because of travel, you should really strive to get as much movement in the airport as you can. Maybe ideally you take the stairs, you don't get on the conveyors. If you can manage to do that, getting a lot of steps will help your body feel less sore, less sluggish. And not all, but a fair amount of the sluggishness that we feel when we don't move around a lot, when inactivity leads us to feel less energy, is the slow movement and the buildup of that lymphatic fluid. And keep in mind that lymphatic fluid isn't quote unquote bad, but it contains a lot of waste products that you do not want sitting around in the local tissues. And I'll underscore that later when we talk about lymphedema that occurs under conditions where somebody's being treated for, say, cancer, and their lymph nodes and their lymph vessels are intentionally destroyed as a way to try and eradicate the cancers that have invaded the lymphatic system. When that happens, you get a lot of swelling of tissue. It can be painful. The tissue can become necrotic, infected, and inflamed, and it can lead to all sorts of local and systemic issues. And cosmetically, of course, it's not good either. Movement is the way you're going to encourage lymphatic flow. Walking is one way to do it. Yes, cardiovascular exercise is excellent for that. And later we'll talk a little bit about the specifics of how cardiovascular exercise benefits your heart. Little hint, it's through growth of lymphatic vessels. Did you know that? Much of the benefit of aerobic exercise for your heart is because of the way that exercise stimulates growth and health of lymphatic vessels, not heart cells directly. We'll get back to that. Walking is terrific. Cardiovascular exercise, these days we are all told we need about 150 to 200 minutes of so-called zone 2 cardio. People debate whether or not it's better to do high-intensity interval training. Look, I think it's all good. It's all excellent. But none of it really is a replacement for just as much movement during the day as possible. I work a desk job. I'm mainly researching podcast episodes or doing research. Back in the days when I was doing experiments in my lab, I was getting up and standing up and moving around a lot. I've noticed that with each passing year, I'm 50 now, with each passing year, I tend to move a lot less just spontaneously and as a requirement of my life, so I do more exercise. But if you move a lot during your day, that's great. Vacuuming, cleaning. This is a great thing for your lymphatic system, okay? This is also an appropriate time to talk about some of the quote-unquote kind of goofy practices that you'll see out there. I'm not calling them goofy, but they can look a little odd, where people, are talking about like shaking their body, or they're talking about jumping up and down or rebounding, jumping on a small trampoline. I confess I own a small trampoline that I jump on in the morning. I just think it's fun. And it turns out to be really good for your lymphatic system, as is treading water, excellent for your lymphatic system. Swimming, excellent for your lymphatic system. There are great studies showing that. And you might say, how is it that jumping up and down is moving lymphatic fluid up toward my heart because I'm jumping down? Wouldn't this be like stamping the fluid down toward gravity? When I was a kid, we used to go to 7-Eleven and we'd get Slurpees, and we wanted to get as much Slurpee in there as we could. And so we used to just like bang the cups there, and we used to get yelled at, no Slurpee stamping. And we would do it anyway. I don't drink Slurpees anymore, so no Slurpee stamping. But we were pushing that ice and fluid down so we could get more in there. Why would rebounding, jumping on a small trampoline, or even shaking or jumping at all, why would it bring the fluid up? Wouldn't it stamp it down? Those lymphatic vessels are one-way vessels. So as you shake the fluid, right, it's going up, 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 up. There's another way to really encourage a lot of lymphatic flow, and this will serve people cosmetically and just generally in terms of feeling of more energetic and it's kind of a lightness in your lower limbs. If you've ever felt a lot of heaviness in your lower limbs, there could be a variety of reasons for that. It could be related to something in your vascular system. It could be because you trained your legs too hard. Almost always, some of that is due to not moving around enough and the buildup of lymphatic fluid in the interstitial space or within the lymphatic vessels themselves. One of the best documented ways to improve lymphatic flow, to improve the rate and the extent of the lymphatic drainage, is actually through breathing. When I first heard this, I thought, oh boy, we're getting into breath work. My lab has studied breath work, aka respiration physiology, and it's known to be powerful, but the domain of breath work oftentimes has naming of breath work practices and stuff that can start seeming a little counterculture, new age woo biohacking, which is not my flavor. But get this, along the network of lymphatic vessels, some of those vessels are somewhat larger, and there's a particularly large compartment that sits within your abdomen called the cisterna chyli. Okay, fancy name, but cisterna chyli is an outpouching or a swelling of the vessels that contains a lot of lymph. And we haven't quite gotten to how lymphatic fluid gets back into the venous supply and joins up for the blood, etc. But the cisterna chyli is kind of like the sink or the drain for a lot of the lymphatic fluid that's made it back to your body, but has not yet made it back to the blood supply, hasn't cleared the lymphatic system yet. So it turns out one of the best ways to encourage the movement of lymph fluid that's already been checked out for infections, et cetera, and that's been taken out of the interstitial space to go back into your blood supply, which is what you want, is through what's called diaphragmatic breathing. And the reason for this is that when you do diaphragmatic breathing, I'll explain how to do that in a moment. It's very simple. The reason diaphragmatic breathing is so useful for encouraging lymph drainage and lymph flow is because when you do diaphragmatic breathing, which is having your belly extend as you inhale. So you have this thing called the diaphragm, which is a muscle inside your body. And when you inhale, the diaphragm moves down. Of course, the lungs inflate. And ideally, your belly moves out a little bit, right? We generally tell people that it's not so good to breathe by lifting your chest and using your ribs, although you can use the muscles between your ribs, the intercostals in your ribs to breathe. But you don't want to be breathing like this. Ideally, diaphragmatic breathing is what you do most of the time, unless you need to breathe much harder. And you're inhaling and your belly's moving out, okay? When you inhale and your belly's moving out, you are certain that you're doing diaphragmatic breathing. Diaphragmatic breathing creates a pressure differential between this cisterna chyli, right, this reservoir of lymph, and your blood supply, which has a different pressure within it. And so if you do a few rounds of diaphragmatic breathing, and when I say rounds, I just mean a few breaths. So inhale deeply and have your belly move out, and then exhale, you're greatly encouraging the passage of lymph from the lymph vessels back into the blood supply, okay? Doing this just 2 or 3 times when you wake up in the morning, doing this 2 or 3 times in the afternoon or in the evening, or really any time that you remember, will really encourage lymphatic drainage. It will really encourage the movement of that lymph fluid. And this is especially important to do if you're stuck on a plane or behind a desk, or you haven't had the opportunity to move quite as much as you would like, because again, the other way to move lymph fluid along is through low-level muscular contractions. But if you're trapped behind a desk or in an airplane seat, you can't do that. So make it a point to do a few diaphragmatic breaths per day, and you will greatly encourage the movement and drainage of lymphatic fluid. And it actually can make a cosmetic difference. It can actually make a real difference in terms of less swelling of your lower body tissues, because as you clear the cisterna chyli, you allow the lymph coming up from your legs and from other locations to also move up, right? Because you're just creating room for it to move into those now empty tubes. So while things like rebounding and turns out treading water in a pool or swimming in a pool is an excellent way to create lymphatic drainage. I mean, it's one of the best ways just because of the way that the physics of the water interacts with those superficial vessels of the skin. You know, as you swim, there's kind of a shearing along of the skin. You might not notice it unless you use a slow motion camera, but there's kind of a rippling of the skin. And those lymphatic vessels that sit just below the skin, those really tiny little capillaries, they're getting kind of squeezed along by the movement, that shearing of the skin along the top. So swimming is great. It's sometimes hard to get access to a pool. A really fun way to do this as well is you can kind of go down to the bottom of the pool and then blast off the bottom, grab a gulp of air, go back down and blast it up and grab a gulp of air. For those of you that have ever seen Laird Hamilton, the great surfer Laird Hamilton, and Gabby Reese, who's also great, his wife, they've developed tools and protocols for this called XPT. I don't have any formal affiliation with XPT, but they've developed a whole set of workouts related to this for general health reasons, for athletic performance, and it will also improve lymphatic drainage and lymphatic passage up from the bottom of the body. And you can think about the physics of bouncing off the bottom of the pool, like doing a squat and then grabbing a gulp of air and going back down and up. That's almost perfect for what we're trying to accomplish when we talk about the movement of lymphatic fluid up and back toward the heart. But most people don't have access to a pool. So low-level muscular contraction from walking, diaphragmatic breathing.